We're talking to Dr. Julian Blackshear, and the topic is the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And of course, Dr. Blackshear, let us give you time now to talk about some aspects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, however you wish to handle it over the next 8 or 10 minutes that we have here.
If you recall, when I talked about the 13th Amendment, we talked about what it takes to be free. Well, that's one element to determine freedom in an English-speaking country. There's another element, and that is the ability to participate in a decision-making process that affects the quality of your life. Now, if you recall, that right is one of the primary reasons for the American Revolution. If you recall that you got Patrick Henry, a person from South Carolina, owned more slaves than you could count, on thousands of acres of land. He was, by every criteria, extremely rich man. But even he said, give me liberty or give me death.
All right.
In other words, money is not even important. What's important is taxation without representation. What's important is for an English parliament to make decisions that he could not participate in, but it was still impacted upon the quality of his life. Thus, when slaves were freed, you had to have the 15th Amendment to give them the right to vote, because that's the only way in this Republican democracy that we would have the right to participate in the decision-making process. Not every day, but at least on voting day, we'd have the right to determine who the elected representatives will be. So it's through the ability to vote that gives us the right to participate in the decision-making process that impacts upon the quality of our lives. Now, if you don't have that right, then you're not free, you see. Now, equality, all slaves were equal, but none of them were free. So you need a Voters' Right Act. And the Voters' Right Act and the 15th Amendment never was enabled. It took the enabling statute to implement that constitutional right in the passage of the 1965 Voters' Right Act. Now we got some guarantees that black people can vote and therefore can participate in the decision-making process that impacts upon the quality of their lives, and now therefore they can be free.
And so you say that the 15th Amendment was never enabled until 1965, Voting Rights Act. Why don't you elaborate upon that?
Well, you can pass a constitutional amendment that establishes a right. But then you got to have the legislative body to implement that right that has been established by the passage of a law. We call that an enabling statute. There has to be some statute passed by Congress that will implement the right that's already been established for black people to enjoy. Now, until you have that enabling statute, you just got a right, but there's nothing to implement that right. And that didn't happen really until the Voters' Right Act of 1965.
Well, now, what impact, since we're talking about voting, what impact did this have on the disfranchisement movement in the southern parts of the United States?
Well, black people could not participate in the decision-making process. Therefore, they had no say-so as to who their elected representatives would be. And that's why you have in-number white sheriffs, white mayors, white representatives in government, and so forth and so forth, so on. But as soon as black people had the right to participate in the decision-making process by voting, then all of a sudden we got black mayors, where heretofore we didn't have any. All of a sudden we got black sheriffs, where heretofore we didn't have any. All of a sudden we got John Lewis and all the other congressmen that are black congressmen that represent various constituencies, both in the South and in the North. We got, even today, a black person is running for the highest office of the land. So if you didn't have that enabling statute, the Voters' Right Act of 1965, I'm not saying this still wouldn't exist, but the likelihood of it being exist will be lessened. You see, it's remote.
You know, sometimes folks talk about Congress' ability to pass a reinforcement of this law. I forget the name that they use.
They're reinstating it. Reinstating the law. The law ordinarily expires upon a certain term, and then we want to reinstate the law, make sure that it doesn't expire, and keep it going, and so forth and so on. That's already happened, so it's still in good stead.
But now some people contend that even though Congress might not pass this law, that still Africans have the right to vote because the 15th Amendment to the Constitution.
But I just told you,
yeah.
if you don't have an enabling statute, you can have a right that there's no means or method by which it can be implemented. That's the reason why you have to have the statute.
It's not that passage every several years, and I forget the name of this law now, but it's not that passage still that 1965 enabling.
It should be made permanent. You know?
Is that not?
In my judgment.
Yeah, that was okay.
Now, you know, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was interpreted by the Supreme Court during the case of Bush versus Gore that allowed Bush to become president of the United States.
Explain that.
All right. One of the requirements of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is that southern states primarily, before they can establish a voting plan and procedures as relates to voting, they must first get permission from the federal government to do so. Now, when you had the problem of recounting votes in Florida, the Supreme Court of Florida ordered a recount, and by doing so established some procedures about which that recount can occur.
Okay.
But they didn't get the permission from the federal government to do so. So the Supreme Court said that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was violated, and then ordered the count to stop. And by ordering the count to stop, Bush was ahead at the time, so he became president of the United States.
And so,
that's real slick.
That's the 15th Amendment to the Constitution.
That's the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that implements the 15th
Amendment to the Constitution.
But the point I'm showing you, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that was primarily the result of trying to make sure that black people can have the right to vote and participate in the decision-making process, was used this time not to make black people free, not to give black folks the right to vote, but just to elect the president of the United States. So that's one of your consequences of a law. It can be different than what you previously intended it for it to be. And it can be used for all purposes.
You know, over the last couple of minutes we have here, Dr. Blackshear, let's see if you might be able to throw out some suggestions.
Real slick way of doing it.
And so some suggestions in terms of what we might do in order to make the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution much more of a force in terms of our system of education and make people knowledgeable of it.
One, you don't have that many qualified teachers, in my judgment, on public school level that are even teaching it. You got people teaching history and never educated in college to teach history. If they're teaching history, they're teaching history or civics or with an educational certificate attached to it. And so they teach these kids the simplistic notion: the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment made them citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Well, if you're not going to be any more comprehensive about that as far as the educational process is concerned on a high school level, then it's pretty understandable why people can grow up and not really know what these rights are all about. Except by listening to your show.
Yeah, but one thing is clear, though, is that that there are a large number of folks who are not voting now. And what we're trying to do
might be another reason for that, because they don't think that it's going to do them any good. You know.
Well, what could you say to somebody over the last minute and 30 seconds in terms of participating in the politics and the things from that perspective?
Well, you know, if I wanted to be, if I want to sanitize the whole thing and reach back several hundred years, I could rely upon the founders of the American Revolution and say that that's one of the reasons why they fought, because they didn't have the right to vote. I suppose if Parliament allowed them to have representation I suppose if England had allowed the colonists to have representation in the Parliament, you may not have had the revolution. But remember the mantra, the call for arms was taxation without representation. So maybe people owe that to their ancestors. Now, another reason, specifically like black people, they ought to vote because they ought to vindicate the loss of lives and limbs on the part of their ancestors who were lynched and killed and firebombed out of the houses for wanting to do this. And now having achieved this right, and not to use it because you're too lazy to get out of bed, that's an affront to the struggles endured by your own ancestors. So that's an obligation that you have to your own history.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Blackshear, let me thank you over the last 10 seconds for the excellent information. And as I told you before, that this would be something that was new.
All I have
and
now?
Of course, let me thank our audience and encourage them to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.